So we've worked out, in the previous video, we worked out the historical growth trend. Now we need to compare that against the actual growth rate. So the actual growth rate we would look at 1947 and compare against 1948. So we would say equal to the log difference. One way of estimating growth is to take the log difference, the log of the log of 1948 minus the log of the first observation of GDP level, so ln 1947, and close brackets. Okay, and we'll do some adjustment here in the cells. So okay, that should be enough. And adjust. And then we take this. Now this is rolling. Let's pull this down. So it's the actual year-on-year growth rate going from one quarter to the next. And so if you like, what we have is the trend and actual. Also, it might be worth noting that in the estimation that we have here, because we've locked the first cell, that in each instance of the regression, the first cell is always the same. It's not rolling. It's more, one way of looking at this is to think of it as a recursive type regression. So maybe I'll use that term, recursive regression. And here we have trend, whereas the actual, so the trend we've generated has come from a recursive regression, whereas the actual figure in terms of growth of real GDP is rolling, because if the cell reference keeps moving in line, whereas for instance here it's first quarter 1947, first quarter 1948, go down a cell, second quarter 1947, second quarter 1948. Whereas here with in terms of the trend is generated from the growth rate, but the growth rate is estimated where the cell reference for the first cell is always locked. So it's not really so much rolling, whereas this is rolling. This is probably better described as being recursive. Okay, now to make sense out of this, we should visualize what we've done. So let's compare the actual growth rate and the trend growth rate. So we could take our raw data, copy and paste. In fact, we might paste this, paste special values. Okay, so I just have the raw data, and I can take the remove the series here, delete without any effect here. I can remove this, so cut. And then to work out the difference between the actual and the trend, let's say a growth gap, we subtract the actual, so the actual subtract away the trend. And when this is when this is negative, it indicates that the actual figure of growth is lower than trend, and when it's positive, it would imply that the actual figure is higher than the trend. Okay, so let's take that down for the entire period. And then we might have a look at, well, we could graph the entire, we could look at, because we have such a lot of data points, it might be interesting just initially to look at the Greenspan period, and the Greenspan period stemmed from 87. So we'll take the second last quarter of 87 all the way through. So let's do a line just to visualize. Okay, edit that, select, remove, add, it's the GG, so growth gap. And we'll look at the period 1987, 87, second last quarter, all the way through Bernanke and Yellen. Okay, I click OK. And of course we can see that during the early, so we can see dips and we can see periods of peak growth. Okay, we could improve this graph, format axis, and the number, we might say we don't need 6, we probably need 4 as first, and we'd also like the format axis. Now just edit, select data, and we'll edit. So we want to put something on the x-axis rather than 1, 2, 3, and maybe we could use our second last quarter, just this date series. Again, this is going to be crowded. Click OK and go back and have a look. And maybe we could make, okay, let's redimension a bit. Let's have a look at this growth cap. Let's see what we can observe. Well, what we observe, I guess, is the 2000. The major fold here in terms of growth comes in 2007, 2008, and we haven't got back to historic trend. So if you like, the level of output, the level of growth in GDP has trailed the historical trend, and this is extremely noticeable during the 2007 period. Okay, so this is a visualization of what's going on, and it offers, if you like, a real-time, almost in terms of trend at least, a real-time perspective on how policymakers would have viewed actual GDP relative to the trend GDP from 1947 onwards. So GDP growth historically, if we take the trend, so let's put this to one side for a second, let's come up, and we could think of, let's at this point introduce a split. Okay, and if we pull this down, we can see, okay, so let's just try to offer some kind of interpretation. If we look at the trend growth rate in GDP from 1947 has from the Greenspan period, so we'll take the early Greenspan period, 1940, 1987, it would have been around 3.6%, and it remained there 3.5, 1996, the 2000s, dips to 3.4, 3.4, and remains at 3.4, 3.3, 3.3, 3.2. Whereas the actual level of growth of GDP from '87 has varied considerably. So if we take when Greenspan took up his post in late 1987, the GDP growth rate, the actual GDP growth rate was about 4.3. That was the year-on-year change, quarterly change. And 88, 4, and then it started to fall and fall very considerably, and actually in the early 1990s, which coincided with substantial falls in real estate values in the early 1990s in places like New England, perhaps Texas. You can see there was negative growth, but the trend would have been positive, and it would have picked up 1993 and come back to 4, so exceeding the historical trend. And mid 1990s down to 2, so growth gap would have been negative. And then 1996 picked up 4%, so very buoyant type of economic activity in the late 1990s. This would have coincided with the later stages of the Clinton administration, and then 2000 millennium bug, and 2001 very low, 2.2%. So the actual GDP growth, and then picked up actually 2001 low, 2002 relatively low, 2003, but then growth picked up very substantially in 2006. So up to 3%, and then we had the financial crisis, and growth declined to 1%, and then growth became negative, and you can see that the growth gap would have been wildly negative. 2008, 2009, very substantial drop in level of economic activity, and then a mild picking up 2013, and 2015 2.2%. So in visualizing level of economic activity, we could take this graph as being a measure of growth relative to a trend, and perhaps use it in the Taylor rule. So the next video clip I'll put up will incorporate this as the growth gap or the output gap in a Taylor rule, and I'll get data for CPI, Consumer Price Index, and the growth gap, and regress that onto the actual Fed funds rate.